Hi, everybody, and welcome. I am Dr. Dan Kalish, and I am here today to speak with you about our cardiometabolic health and longevity module that we are coming up to launch later this month, which is part of our larger year-long certification program in longevity. So we're going to talk about the class itself and also give you an overview about what the view, so the bigger picture of longevity treatments and what's available out there, and what are the things that we can do to really make a big difference for people. So let's take a look here and start with an introduction to the actual class. So I've taken the last 15 years of my life working with a scientist named Dr. Richard Lord, who was the founder of the lab testing that we now use on a regular basis. He was the first one to do GI microbiome testing. His lab was the first one to do amino acids and fatty acids and organic acids and all the antioxidant testing. So Richard's long been retired, but he and I have worked together for quite some time now on a big picture concept, which I have turned into this class of a year for you all. So I have curated all the work that I've done with Richard. I've curated all the work that I've seen out there in the longevity field for these last 31 years that I've been in practice, and taken it and crammed it into a condensed 4-module course for you. Okay, and the 4 modules are: the first one we're launching now, cardiometabolic health. That's obviously related to cardiovascular health and metabolic disorders. Environmental toxins and detoxification, it's an important one. We have a gut-brain module, and then one on hormones and immune. So throughout the year, we have these 4 modules, and I've taken all this information and put it into the relevant sections, both related to lifestyle and most importantly, related to functional medicine lab testing assessments that you can do easily in your own office on all the patients that you want. So I've created a system where you can have a logical flow as you take people through cardiometabolic health, detoxification protocols, hormone and immune balancing, and gut-brain health to address the main problems that people are worried about as they get older, which would be having a heart attack, diabetes, high blood pressure, cholesterol issues, all that kind of stuff you associate with the development of heart disease and development of metabolic problems and obesity, weight gain. To address the gut-brain axis, because aren't we all a little bit worried, not so much about our guts, but about our brains and chronic onset of some neurodegenerative disease? That's not a pleasant thought. And then hormones and immune, that would be related to anything to do with your immune system, whether it's a post-COVID, long-haul COVID type reaction, or people that are worried about different forms of cancer that they may develop. So we're trying to address all the different chronic illnesses and be able to detect and understand the mechanisms that trigger these diseases long before they would appear in a person, so you can have healthy patients. And then there's another layer on top of that, I think, that we can talk about, which is once you have a healthy patient, you have organ systems that are healthy, you have cells that are healthy, then what do you do with that health that they've created? Well, that's a whole nother can of worms. Then you get into things like meditation practices and breathing exercises and heat exposure and cold exposure and physical fitness and VO2 max levels and muscle strength and develop and all those kinds of things. And that has to be a component to the program as well. And so as we're going through this, we as practitioners have to be doing these things ourselves as well too. So you have to have at the end of this year a sauna and a cold plunge and a personal trainer, or figure out how that you're going to exercise and do strength training and get your VO2 max to where it should be and have your diet dialed in, right? We have to be the living embodiment of these programs in order to be able to sell them to our patients. And in fact, in some ways, I feel like patients are buying us as a role model, and we're stepping them through these various processes. So as part of the course, we definitely want all of you testing yourselves and getting yourselves healthy. And isn't that what it's all about, right? That you can then carry on that information and pass it on to your patients. So that's really the goal. So for those of you that are brand new, I'll introduce myself briefly. I am Dan Kalish. I'm the founder of the Kalish Institute. I've been in practice for a really long time, over 30 years. We've trained thousands of practitioners at the Kalish Institute. I've worked with the Mayo Clinic. We've had our students placed at the Cleveland Clinic. We've had all kinds of interactions with just about every company in the functional medicine space. And what I'm most proud of is that we produce through our lab trainings some of the best clinicians in the industry that really understand the physiology and biochemistry and lab interpretation skills that they need to be successful practitioners. I also focus a lot on business development and the practical aspects of patient management in our various level 1 courses, now also in the longevity class that we're launching as of this month, and in the mentorship that I've been doing since 2006. We have communities of practitioners that are sharing information. They're learning from the curriculum that I put together. They're learning from each other, and we're all learning from their patients. And it's an inspirational group. If you've ever been in one of these courses and you're on the webinar, we have weekly calls or regular calls for these different classes, and we're all reviewing labs together, and there's a sense of camaraderie and shared joy and suffering with the practitioners. In fact, this morning in one of the courses, we had again like 15 practitioners on the line, and one of them is sharing this case of this 3-year-old child who was extremely sick. And in about a month, this relatively new functional medicine practitioner completely reversed the course of this child's illness. And she told us exactly how she did it. She showed us the lab. We had already designed the protocol in class earlier. She implemented it, and here a month later, she's got a life-changing result for this little kid. So there's a sense of confidence and inspiration, I think, that happens, which I try to embody as I'm teaching in these courses. But it's even more inspirational in my mind when you hear a new student who's just solved a really complex case and understands why that happened, and it was all lab-based, science-based stuff. And so that's really what we're trying to do here, is create practitioners of the best quality and do it in groups, all right? So now, for this specific subject, again, I broke out the longevity programs that we may do in functional medicine into 4 component parts. And now for today, we're going to mostly focus on the cardiometabolic part of this, but I'm going to introduce the other parts too so you can see the bigger picture as well. But we're going to focus on cardiometabolic because that's the course that we're launching with this month for those of you that are interested. And you can take the cardiometabolic class by itself, or you can take it as part of the year-long certification in longevity medicine. However you want to do it, it's up to you. And you can talk with my team or myself about the different logistics if you want to do the full year or if you just want to do it, one class at a time. Okay. So for learning objectives on just the cardiometabolic part, and we're going to breeze over these today and introduce them. We're thinking about one of the most important things with longevity is mitochondrial health. I think everybody pretty much agrees that ATP production matters a lot, and that as we get older, it can tend to decrease, and that causes a lot of problems. If your mitochondria are not up to speed, you're going to start to have a lot of potential diseases of aging that are really unnecessary. If you can keep your mitochondria in good shape, you can avoid most of those, okay? And then we're going to talk a little bit about insulin sensitivity and how that plays in. And then I want to focus a lot on cellular repair and protein misfolding and protein folding, because you hear a lot about autophagy, you hear a lot about protein folding and misfolding in the longevity space. And we'll just talk about what that actually means and how it works. We're going to have a whole bunch of slides on that coming up. I think that's particularly interesting and particularly important, because if you cannot make your proteins appropriately and they don't fold right, you're in some pretty deep trouble. And there's some straightforward ways to test for that and correct for that. We're going to talk very briefly about the cell danger response, because it's very important in terms of inflammation and immune responses and all that stuff. And then a little bit about exercise. Okay, so this is just a broad overview today of what's in the larger courses that we're teaching. Now, again, when you think of it from a body systems perspective, cardiometabolic kind of makes sense, right? That's the #1 killer, would be heart disease. And then of course, obesity is running rampant, and we want our patients fit. We want their hearts fit. We want their muscles fit. We want them to have a great, cardiorespiratory capacity. We want all these things. And I don't think anyone in the longevity space argues with the fact that exercise and fitness and muscle strength, muscle mass, your VO2 max, your zone 2 capacity, all these things are the most essential and the most important and the biggest levers that you can move to have a healthy person and to live a long life. So we have to look at that from both the lifestyle side of what kinds of exercise are appropriate. And a lot of the times you can see this on the labs. You can see on the lab someone has a problem with fatty acid oxidation, also called beta oxidation. They're not burning fat well. So you want to customize their exercise program to focus on that. That would be zone 2 exercise. And at the same time, give them the nutrients that the lab indicates to get that to work better. So we're doing very personalized programs here using specific lifestyle interventions that we're guided to just based on common sense, but also based on the labs. If you have a person that has a big problem with glycolysis on the lab, and maybe their pyruvic acid is really high, then you're going to want to prescribe a different kind of exercise to get that mechanism working along with the supplements that are going to fix that. So you can get very targeted with your programs here. The second module that we're going to be teaching later this year is the gut-brain axis. And neurotransmitter problems, neuroinflammation, neurodegenerative diseases, like we just don't want to go anywhere near there. And as I was talking about with this 3-year-old kid this morning in this morning's class, when you fix the gut, miraculous things happen in the brain, because gut inflammation turns out to trigger problems with the brain. And stress, of course, that's affecting the brain can affect the gut and whatnot. So anyways, it's very important to understand how the microbiome works, how the commensal bacteria work, and how we're going to test for and then correct the commensal bacteria specifically. And there's a very in-depth course I put together on this. I spent probably 2.5, 3 years working with Richard Lord, him teaching me his view of the microbiome. And again, he's the scientist that did the first microbiome testing in integrative medicine quite some time ago, and knows a lot about it, probably about as much as anyone does in our space, right? And then we're going to get into hormone balances and then a big section on detoxification, because environmental toxins are just a drag and you don't want them to be pulling your patients down. Okay, so these are the 4 pillars of longevity, we're calling them. These are the 4 modules, and we've got in each one of these sections overarching big picture stuff about longevity and what our goals are, and then we dive deep into these individual topics in each module. Each module is around 3 months long. Each module has a whole bunch of live calls where we're going to review labs and talk about cases. And it's cumulative, right? At the end of the year, you should have a really good understanding of how to set up a longevity clinic, a longevity practice, and customize what I'm teaching here to suit the needs of your patients in your practice, okay? So 4 essential modules, lab-based protocols. We're going to start off today mostly talking about mitochondrial function and the cardiometabolic stuff, because that's the one that's coming up. But we have this whole broader picture in mind. And as you go through the year-long certification, there's tie-ins too, right? There's ways that we have, I don't know, it could be something as simple as, I don't know, an anti-inflammatory, like fish oil, right? And how does that relate? It relates to all the things that we're talking about. It certainly relates to your brain. It's used a lot for depression. Certainly relates to cardiometabolic health, right? And it relates to hormones, absolutely, right? And so there's sort of a bigger picture to see here about how specific nutrients and specific lab markers can sort of reflect across all these different areas of the body. So there's something to be said about treating this as in terms of systems and then being able to see how the systems are impacted. So for those of you that are interested in the course, you can scan this QR code. And if you're in this mini series and you're registered here and you want to do the whole year-long class, you can save up to $1,000 basically if you register in the next week or two. And there's some complicated stuff. You can talk to my staff about how all the discounts work, but they can give you the details on that. But it's starting March 25th, okay? So it's coming up sooner than we could imagine. And then if you just want to do the one class, that's fine too. You can save like $300 using this QR code. If you just want to check it out, do the cardiometabolic one only, see if you like it. You could then join the other classes later if you want, or maybe you don't have enough time this year to do them all. You can kind of spread them out as you like it. But if you want to do 4 in a row, that would be every 3 months, start a new course, then you should do the year-long thing. And if you're not sure yet, you just want to try the first one, then you can jump in and just do this one by itself and make your decision later on about what you're going to do, okay? All right, so let's get into some content here and think about how does this really work? There's so many big topics here. We're not going to be able to cover off on all of this, but I have a few slides on each of these so you can see what we're going to get into in depth on in the actual module itself. Mitochondrial health, insulin resistance, protein folding, enzyme functions, genes, and the cell danger response. I mean, that's a lot right there. But let's try to maybe start with the biggest picture possible, okay? So in this module, we're going to cover metabolic processes. That's how the mitochondria makes energy, the enzymes that are related to that, and how those enzymes are produced. And then we're going to look at insulin resistance, and insulin resistance is probably the biggest problem that could occur in the body just globally, because that's going to trigger problems with the brain, obviously with weight gain. It's going to create problems with the mitochondria. It's going to create problems with your blood vessels, with your blood pressure, right? So insulin resistance ends up being sort of a catch-all evil, you know, for it's the dark side in a way. If you're watching, I'm sorry, but we're in the middle of watching all 9 Star Wars movies in my family right now, so there's a lot of dark side and go with the Force Luke conversations. Insulin resistance. If there's a dark side in the human body, it's insulin resistance. It's like responsible for all the bad things. Okay, and we don't want that to happen. If there's like the force in the body, maybe like a good thing, I would say it's probably protein synthesis, and we're going to get into that in a minute. Okay, and then you have to exercise. People have to exercise. There's no point in even discussing giving someone a supplement if they're not willing to start to get physically fit, because you can't take a whole complicated bunch of longevity drugs, longevity treatments, longevity supplements, and load up on berberine and resveratrol and metformin and then not work out on a regular basis. That's just, it makes no sense, and it wouldn't work, and it would be probably self-destructive in some kind of way. So whatever it is that we have to do to get to exercise ourselves and to get our patients to exercise, this is a really important thing. I think it's like in my mentorship class, it's probably diet and getting people to do gluten-free and blood sugar control. That's kind of like, if you can't do that, you're not going to get people healthy. In longevity medicine, if you're not getting people physically fit, there's really no point in doing a program. Now, that doesn't happen right away, and it could take you easily a year or two to convince a patient that they should exercise on a regular basis and getting them doing it. I'm not saying that's going to happen right away, but it's got to be a core tenet of what you're doing. And you don't have to be so hardcore that you tell people, you can't do this program unless you're going to work out. It's more that let's start this program and let's figure out how we're going to incorporate exercise into your life every day, so that all of a sudden at the end of a year or two, it's a big part of what you're doing to stay healthy and to keep yourself going. And if you combine these things, a healthy diet, the right kinds of exercise at the right time for each individual, and then the lab-based protocols, then things come together, zippity zip. People feel great and have great energy, and all the things that they want to have happen start to happen in a really positive way. All right, so now when I we really look at the longevity field, and I've read all the books in the last couple years that have come out, and a lot of them are written by people I know quite well, actually, and I've talked to a lot of people about the subject and thought about it quite a lot. And I think that the work I did with Dr. Lord was probably the most impactful in the way that, where can we start? And we start with lifestyle, and we get into that with exercise and the diets that people should eat and those kinds of things. But then where do you start from a clinical application of looking at someone's biochemistry? It has to be at the level of the cell. If you don't have healthy cells, it really doesn't matter what you layer on top. You could take every complex longevity treatment that's out there, and if you're layering that on top of a person with unhealthy cells, it's a complete waste of time and money to do those other things. And so then that means that then we have to be able to assess the cell and understand what makes a healthy cell, and how can we tell if this person's cells are healthy or not. And that's really, to me, like ground zero. And there's some fundamental things that just have to be happening in a cell for it to work properly. And it's not like this is a big mystery, right? Things like glutathione has to be present to protect the cell. Methylation has to work for DNA to work properly, et cetera, right? There's a whole series of things that have to happen. And so we're putting all those together in these different modules so you can make sure that you can check each one of these things for your patients. But for the purpose of this first module, where we're talking about the health of the heart and the health of the blood vessels and the health of your metabolic functions, then let's look at it from that perspective, okay? So number one, plasma membranes. Membranes, everything's happening at the level of the membrane. Half of the membrane, well, depending on what kind of cell it is, somewhere between half of the membrane and a little bit more is going to be fatty acids, and then the other half is made up of proteins. and the proteins are doing things and moving things around and whatnot. And then the plasma membrane is this, sort of sitting there protecting you and having its own little fun time. And if you don't have great, super healthy membranes, then things going in and out of the cell is not going to work well. You can't protect the cell. The cell is just kind of vulnerable. Not to like really dwell on Star Wars here, but yeah, in the episode we were watching last night, the shields went down for a little while on the good guy's ship. Shields down, not good. They are getting hit by all the like photon torpedoes or whatever, and things are blowing up. It's not looking good. And then the guy went, he cranked on something and shields up. Okay, so if you don't have shields up, if you don't have these membranes working well, it's impossible to have a healthy cell. DNA repair seems pretty self-evident that if you're not able to repair your DNA that's damaged, you're at risk for some pretty bad problems, whether it's cancer or some other defect in the different proteins that you're making. It's going to be an issue. And then, as I mentioned, I think the sort of most important sort of gold in all this is protein biosynthesis, making proteins. And we're going to talk about that for a little bit because this is an easy thing to check and fix. And if you don't fix this, nothing else is really going to work. Of course, you have to have antioxidants at the right level. And that's complicated. We talk about this a lot in the various classes I teach. We had a case this morning, for example, where they had low, and the student brought this up, and it was a very astute student. They had low omega-3 fatty acids. Okay, imagine that. So what does that mean? Right away, that means that the plasma membranes are not working right. Low omega-3s means the plasma membranes are not working right because those are some of the more important fatty acids in the membrane. So right away, you know there's a membrane problem. And guess what? On top of that, the patient had a problem with lipid peroxides. So there was the fat-soluble antioxidants were diminished. There weren't enough of them to protect the plasma membranes. So low omega-3s, poor quality plasma membrane, high levels of lipid peroxides. That means that the membranes are getting damaged. So you have a poor quality membrane that's getting damaged. That's like double bad, okay? And that's going to eventually cause a pretty big problem. So you want to check for and be able to correct all these different things. Cellular regeneration, inflammation, insulin resistance, all these things we're going to detect on the labs and be able to turn around and correct, retest the person and make sure that things are working great. So there's lab assessments for all of this. And most of the free webinars I do, we do lab review. I'm not doing that tonight because there's too much to cover, but just for sure, the longevity classes are all heavily lab-based, lab interpretation skills. That's really what they're about. We're just not going to interpret labs today, okay? Because I want to talk more about the theoretical part of it. And then here's some nutrients that relate to these aspects of the cell. I just jotted down a few so you can get your brain thinking about what does this even really mean? Cell membranes, well, how do you repair them? Fatty acids, omega-3s, omega-6s, lipid peroxidation, I just mentioned. If that's up, that means that you have a problem with lipids being damaged. That means membranes are being damaged. And by the way, neurons have a lot of membrane in them, right? They're long cells. So your brain is very susceptible to membrane problems, very susceptible. You can use phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylserine, CoQ10, vitamin E, omega-3s. There's a whole bunch of ways that you can repair cell membranes depending on what's going on. For protein synthesis, you can look at messing around with mTOR. You can use amino acids. You can use branch chain aminos. You can use leucine, magnesium, folate, super important part of the whole methylation process, etc. For antioxidant protection, a lot of these are used in longevity programs. Things like resveratrol are super common, But we want to test for this so that we're using a logic-based, lab-based set of programs, and it's not just this, I think you need this because it makes sense, right? It's more, based on that individual's genes, that individual's lab markers. And then nutrient levels, super important. Obviously, you gotta have all the right nutrients. And this is just the basics of cellular health. This isn't particularly complex in a way, but it's something that people, skip over quite a bit. And here's a cell. This is what we're looking after first, getting healthy cells. And if the patient can check off all these boxes, if they have healthy cells, and how do we define that? Well, it's right here. It's these things are healthy: the membrane, the protein synthesis capacity, antioxidant protection, and nutrient levels. So healthy cells. If they're toxin free, so you run their toxin profile and there's no more toxins left in their body, that's chemicals, heavy metals, mold, all that junk that accumulates in people's bodies. If their hormones and immune system are online and working well, if their brain has no inflammation and the neurotransmission lines are open and communicating well, and if their microbiome is super healthy, then you're done with round one. That gets the person the basics that they need. In other words, gut health, because their microbiome is perfectly balanced, toxin free, so there's no toxins running around causing all kinds of problems in their body, hormones and immune system balanced, all the metabolic factors are the cardio, respiratory factors are all controlled for. Now you've got someone who's basically got healthy cells, has nutrient levels that are working well, and then you can take that person and put them through more advanced longevity programs. But if you don't have those foundational issues sorted out, I don't know how much it makes sense to do really complicated other things that are not going to necessarily move the needle if these basic factors aren't controlled for. So that's the premise of the course. And you think that we want people, it's reasonable, right? You want to have a healthy microbiome, be toxin free, have your hormones and immune system working really well, and have your mitochondria and cells in like the best shape of your life. That seems like a reasonable and kind of low bar to start with. And I'll tell you, when you start to run these basic labs on the people from a longevity perspective, you're going to find a lot to work on this foundational level. And then when you get that dialed in, then you can move to the fun stuff, the meditation, the heat, the cold, the other kinds of more exotic treatments that you might want to do, IVs. There's a whole nother world out there once you've got the foundation set. Okay, so let's just talk. I think we have time. Yeah, we're pretty good on time. So we're going to talk a little bit of a deep exploration here about protein folding. You hear a lot about autophagy, apoptosis, protein misfolding and folding. So I just thought about what it really is for a minute. Let's just talk about it. And this is kind of high school biology. I know for all of us that we all had to study this in school for a while, but I mean, I don't know that it's like top of your mind. So let's just kind of do a quick review of AP biology, and then we can look at how it relates to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And these may not affect people as much in terms of death as heart attacks do, heart disease, but they're certainly horrific and top of mind for everybody, I think. And so you want to have a strategy so you can assess and and avoid people even entering into any of these degenerative neurological conditions. So DNA directs protein synthesis. How does that work? You remember there's this double-stranded DNA, there's messenger RNA, and basically if you want to take the short version of it, your body's taking these amino acids and stringing them together based on the DNA coding, okay? And this is happening at a pretty high rate all the time in your body. And so when we think about that process, that is in some ways one of the most essential, maybe not the most essential because you can't really say the most essential, it's too exclusive, but it's certainly in the top 2 or 3 essential body processes that have to be working right for your cells to be healthy and then for the organs to be healthy. And if that's not happening, you're going to have some pretty significant problems. Because proteins make up everything that we're talking about. Proteins make up the enzymes that relate to mitochondrial energy production. Uh, Proteins make up, what's carrying the oxygen around your blood, hemoglobin. There's proteins that are structural. There's proteins that make up the digestive enzymes that we're working in the microbiome. Microbiome is completely dependent on having the right enzymes and proteins working in it. So it sort of spreads across all the different body systems. Your immune systems, your antibodies are all proteins. You just, insulin, it's the hormone, it's a protein. You can't really get away from that. And if there's a problem there it's just so foundational, that's going to impact all these other body systems that we're talking about. Now, specifically in terms of, the cardio part of this, we have healthy cells generating ATP, and there's one, system that you're supplying ATP to that you really never want to run out, because if your heart stops beating, even for a short period of time, it's a pretty big problem. So you have to have enough ATP to continuously contract your heart. That's a really kind of central issue, you know. And if you have a lot of oxidative stress from making a lot of energy production, you need a lot of antioxidants to balance that out. And so we want to check and see if that's happening in the person's body or not. And then on top of that, if they're not exercising and they're not, stressing their heart with high intensity exercise often enough, then the heart just gets fibrotic and gnarly and smaller and not very well high functioning, just like a muscle would. If you haven't exercised or you haven't stretched in a long time, your muscles get fibrotic and small and they shrink and they don't work as well. Well, your heart is a muscle, right? The same thing happens there. And you definitely don't want your heart getting smaller and not working well. If you're overweight and you put on too much body fat, then your heart starts to accumulate fat, which somehow when you see fat around a heart, it just seems to me like it's a little scary, a little gross, a little scary, but it's, the reality of what we're up against, okay? And now for ATP, here's a fun fact for you. We make our body weight in ATP every day. Your body weight in ATP. And I had to look this up. It's true. It's like we make between 110 and 160 pounds of ATP every day. Some of it is recycled and some of it is new, but we're producing that much ATP. And it's something like, I think it's septillion is the number, but it's 59 septillion molecules of ATP. And that's 59 with 25 zeros after it. It's a pretty big number. I didn't bother putting it on a slide because it's such a long number. But anyways, we're making a lot of ATP every day. And the system is running at such a high rate. If there's even little glitchy things with it, then it's not going to work as well as you would want it to, okay? And so we want to have, I think this is, by most longevity experts, in the top, it's always in the top 3 or 4 most important things, is making sure your mitochondria are working well. And I don't think anybody does a better job of that than functional medicine docs doing, this kind of testing, because we can see every aspect of mitochondrial function and tweak it and fix it in a really straightforward way. And so here we have the basic schematic. We have energy coming in from fat, from carbohydrate, from protein. It's all getting converted into acetyl-CoA in the citric acid cycle itself inside the mitochondria. We're running all these pathways. And then finally, we have the electron transport chain, where the electrons bounce along that chain you remember studying about in school, and then we end up making ATP. So we can measure each one of these steps and see, where is there a problem? Is there a problem here with beta oxidation? Is there a problem here with glycolysis? Is there a problem with B vitamins here? Is there a problem with citrate? Is there a problem with CoQ10? All this can be measured. And you want every single one of these to work perfectly. That's a healthy mitochondria. And if it's not, then you know exactly what kind of intervention you want to do, whether it's lifestyle, exercise-based or diet-based, or if it's going to be more related to supplementation. And as I mentioned earlier, if beta oxidation is not working well, you not only want to use the nutrient carnitine and B2 and magnesium, but you want to prescribe zone 2 exercise, which improves beta oxidation specifically. Pretty simple. And if you combine those two together, the synergistic effects are far greater than just doing one by itself. And another way of saying that is if you just tell somebody, oh, you should do zone 2 exercise, because everybody says that's really important for longevity. But what if their markers for beta oxidation are through the roof? This happens all the time. You'll see this literally every day in your practice. So they're out there doing their zone 2 all the time, and their beta oxidation screwed up. They're not going to get anywhere near the benefit out of it that they could. So it's not that they shouldn't be exercising. It's not that exercise is bad, but you want to make sure that beta oxidation is working if you're trying to get a person to burn fat. And you can just check it. It's easy to check with organic acids. It's not even complicated. Okay, super easy. There's some amino acids you need to check too. That's your clinical tip for the day. Lysine, remember the amino acid lysine? That doesn't get a lot of press. Lysine is required, the amino acid lysine is required for making carnitine. So sometimes if you see a lysine deficiency and a carnitine deficiency and a beta oxidation deficiency, or problem, they're all related. Simple dimple. You give them lysine and carnitine and zone 2 exercise all together in a package, and boom, they're off and running. Literally, not figuratively. Literally, they're off running or often biking or often swimming or whatever it might be. Okay, but if again they don't have enough carnitine and the person's not tested and they're out there zone tuning themselves, zone 2ing themselves to death, not getting the results they want, hey, maybe it's because if you don't have carnitine, you can't run beta oxidation. It doesn't matter how much zone 2 you do, it's just not going to work. And I had this one professional cyclist a while ago. His name is Chris. I don't know. Some patients you just never forget. He was like in his early 40s, but he's very serious about cycling. He's still a professional cyclist, not at the highest level, but like what a 40-year-old would be doing. And I put him on carnitine, and he'd been doing zone 2 exercise his whole life, right, as a professional cyclist. All I did for this guy was put him on carnitine and some B vitamins. And he came back in a couple weeks and he was so excited. He was like, I'm crushing it. I'm beating the 20-year-olds. I'm on the bike. I'm back like I was when I was younger. All he was missing was carnitine. It wasn't a lack of conditioning or fitness or exercise. He just couldn't keep up his zone 2 with the younger people because he didn't have enough carnitine in his system. Okay, so there's a biochemical reality to all this, and you can't overcome it just by doing more and more and more zone 2. If your carnitine is deficient, you can't shuttle the fatty acids. It's just not going to work. It's not possible. You're not going to just do it with willpower. So anyways, combination of lab testing and lifestyle is really what gets people great. So then the more that you study about insulin resistance, the more that you just become afraid of it and you realize there's insulin resistance in the brain, there's insulin resistance. Oh my gosh, the first thing that happens is that your muscles become insulin resistant, and then your liver, and then your fat cells themselves start to have a problem. And then you get inflamed, and then it creates oxidative stress, and it's this vicious cycle where now your muscles are insulin resistant, and then your liver starts to get fatty, and then your fat cells become insulin resistant themselves, and so they're not processing things, and then everything that we just said there is creating oxidative stress and inflammation, and that's going to lead to high cholesterol, high blood pressure, high triglycerides, high risk of having plaquing in the arteries because everything is starting to get damaged, right? And so this is a pretty big problem, and it's something that you have to kind of get in there and figure out quickly, in the first stage. And it's not hard to fix if you're doing the right things with diet, obviously, and a diet that's not going to provoke insulin problems, and the supplements that are necessary based on the labs. So again, insulin resistance, it starts in muscle tissue. When you eat a meal, muscle is responsible for around 80 to 90% of the uptake of glucose. So if you have adequate muscle mass, and if those muscles have adequate numbers of mitochondria, right, and they're working well, then you've got a potential solution. The mitochondria allow you to burn up energy, and the muscle tissue itself is able to pull in the glucose. And if you don't do that, if you don't have enough muscle mass, and the mitochondria are not doing very well, then you're going to have a problem burning up the glucose. You're going to have a problem pulling it into the muscle tissue. There's not enough muscle there to do that. And then eventually the muscles themselves become insulin resistant, so the whole system starts to break down. Later on, it spreads to your liver. You can have fatty liver. Then your liver starts to really screw up. It's not making the things that it should, and it's making the wrong things. And then eventually this can even end up having a problem with insulin resistance in the brain, which starts to impair cognitive function. So insulin resistance is kind of at the heart of all bad things, and we want to make sure that we're dealing with that. It's not particularly complicated. We test for all these things. We test for pyruvic acid and lactic acid and all the different markers that are related to blood sugar. And you can pick up insulin resistance at a very early stage using these kinds of tests. There are even some amino acids that are required. I think alanine is probably the most famous one to keep your blood sugar regulated well. And then there's, of course, certain nutrients like chromium, biotin, lipoic acid that are essential as well. So insulin resistance can be a huge problem. With diet, lifestyle changes, along with lab-based things. We can reverse this, and you can make yourself insulin sensitive again. So your fatty liver starts to burn off its fat. Your skeletal muscle starts to become larger amount of skeletal muscle and a higher functioning mitochondria, so you're using fatty acids properly, and start to get rid of some of the body fat as well. And so we're measuring all these things, and there's some of these molecules, some of the B vitamin derivatives are super, notorious, I don't know if that's the right word, famous in longevity medicine, like NAD+, NMN, there's a mononucleotide bodylipase. There's like maybe 3 or 4 of these that are used frequently. And they can be great, and you can really fire up someone's mitochondria, like literally in a day, with some of these supplements. But it's kind of a little more responsible to actually look at the entire set of pathways and not just dump a bunch of NMN into somebody's body or a bunch of NAD plus without having some understanding of how that's going to affect them and how it's going to affect B vitamins in general. There's a really strong role for thiamine in all of this, B1. There's a huge role for pantothenic acid, as its name would imply. And, there's all these B vitamins need to work in concert. And I think there's some of them have been sort of singled out as being extra important. And that's just not the biochemical reality when you start to look at the labs and what's going on for people. Okay. But if you have problems with glycolysis or with insulin resistance, you'll see pyruvic acid and lactic acid levels changing. That's directly related to the B vitamins as well. And things like thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, pantothenic acid, they'll make a huge difference, lipoic acid, in getting insulin sensitivity to come back. And you can monitor it with the labs. You can see when the person is insulin sensitive and when they're not. Okay, I'm going to pause and take a sip of water because now we're getting into the really interesting part. So we've talked a little bit about protein folding. We did a refresher for 30 seconds on high school biology where you had the DNA and doing all this stuff. Now we're going to get into protein folding and misfolding for a minute. This turns out to be one of the more important processes. So here we have our amino acids, and there are only 20 that make up all the proteins in the body. And except for collagen, which only has 3, except for collagen, take collagen out of the equation, all the proteins in the body have the same 20 amino acids in about the same ratios. What differentiates our proteins and why an insulin molecule is different from a hemoglobin molecule and is different from an antibody is the sequence of the amino acids, which is what the DNA is encoding for. And so when we talk about protein folding and protein misfolding, the thing that's folding up is a string of these amino acids. And so if your DNA has a little glitch in it, sometimes we call that a SNP, or a single nucleotide polymorphism, you're going to have an amino acid in the wrong place, or the wrong amino acid in a place. And so you get a protein that's dozens or hundreds of amino acids long, and there's an amino acid that's in the wrong place. It's not going to fold properly because the way the proteins fold is reliant upon the amino acids. The amino acids are in a string. They each have charges that repel and attract and do different things. And so that's what creates the actual folding. And from that string of amino acids, we form these alpha helixes and these beta sheets, and then those start to fold together based on their attractions. And eventually you end up with a full-on protein. I think this one is actually a hemoglobin molecule. This is what a hemoglobin molecule looks like. But important to remember, it's just a string of amino acids that was linked together based on your DNA. So if the DNA replication process isn't working well, that's an issue. This is why we include genetic testing to see, is there a tendency to have certain problems with detoxification or with methylation or with dopamine production or whatever you may see on a genetic test. That means there's a tendency that the person may be stringing these together in the wrong way. And then you can see the expression of that on the functional tests. So protein misfolding can happen at the level of the SNP, right? And then protein misfolding also just happens as we get older because we're getting older and everything's, not working quite as zippily as it used to. And so there's a mechanism for correcting for this. Cellular mechanisms that address protein misfolding. So it could be a misfolded protein because you strung it together wrong, because you have a genetic tendency to do that. It could be a misfolded protein. Let's see, I have a list of reasons why here. It could also be a misfolded protein for a whole bunch of other reasons. It could be an environmental toxin. It could be oxidative stress. It could be insulin resistance. All these things could trigger it, okay? And so we want to have a system in place that can repair these misfolded proteins and deal with them. Super, super important. And then we have this term that you hear about all the time in longevity called autophagy. And in autophagy, we are engulfing and degrading these large protein aggregates. Okay, and I'll show you what those aggregates look like on the next slide here. So heat shock proteins, these are pretty interesting. Family of proteins that function as molecular chaperones. Dr. Laura describes them as little mini hospitals for your proteins on a microscopic level. So it's like your cell has a little special place, like a little, hospital, where it's going to grab proteins, bring it over there, proteins that are misfolded, and it's going to refold them. How amazing is that? Okay, and that again is the very definition of cellular repair. Rather than having this misfolded protein clump together with other misfolded proteins and cause these problems, okay, you're actually repairing it. And this is conducted by heat shock proteins. So heat shock proteins themselves are activated as one would suspect by heat. So for example, if you're in a sauna for 20 minutes every day, you're massively activating your heat shock proteins, which are the hospitals inside the cell for correcting misfolded proteins. So this is one of the many reasons why sauna is so good for you. It's also obviously has a huge impact on your heart, which is very positive too. I think about heat shock proteins every time I get in the sauna because I'm in there almost every day and it's like 200 degrees, I don't know, 205, 210. It's hot and it's not pleasant. And I'm looking at the watch and I'm like, okay, it's 12 minutes. And I just think, okay, I gotta hang in there until 20 minutes. I gotta get my heat shock proteins going. It's nice to have a picture of what's actually happening. I have this little imagination of all my, misfolded proteins are getting repaired. And I'm like, oh, this is worth it. This is worth it. It's worth sweating this one out. You can also activate heat shock proteins, unsurprisingly, by exercise, because with exercise, you're increasing the heat inside your body. Lots of things are going to trigger this, but here's a nice little blow up on what is actually happening. So you have a folded protein, like I just showed you earlier. Here's a sort of version of it, and then what's going to happen to it if it becomes misfolded? What's going to happen to it? You could refold it with these heat shock proteins. HSP there, heat shock proteins, little green guys, okay? So you got a protein, it's been damaged now, it's misfolded. Now your heat shock proteins are refolding it. And now what do? They just push it back out there. It's like, okay, go back out there, do your protein thing, whatever you are. If you're, I don't know, an enzyme, if you're a pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme, then go deal with the blood sugar problem that we have. If you're whatever the protein is, right, just go back out there and do your job. But now, and you can also degrade or break them down because everything has a lifespan. So for some of these misfolded proteins, your body just breaks them down and degrades them. And what happens then? Well, then it squirts it out, and then all those amino acids get picked up in the bloodstream, and then your body uses them to make a new protein, or they can stay within the cell. You could use them inside the cell. So you're just recycling the amino acids if you're successfully degrading or breaking down the protein. So those are good scenarios. Either it gets refolded or you break it down and reuse the amino acids. And we have something like 300 to 400 grams a day of protein that we're synthesizing in the body. It is turning over 300 to 400 grams. That's a lot. You think about like if you eat, I don't know, like 20 or 30 grams of protein, how much protein that is. We're turning over 300 to 400 grams every day through these processes I'm talking about here, okay? It's a lot. And when you make a protein, some of these proteins only last for 10 minutes. I think that's the shortest lived proteins in the body. And then some of them last for a couple of days, but none of them last forever. So there's this constant turnover process. Now, when things go bad, there's failed refolding. And now, rather than being successfully broken down or going back out there in its old protein state, kind of rebuilt, these failed to fold proteins clump together. They call it aggregation. And then that aggregation causes either pathology or apoptosis. Right? Apoptosis would mean that the cell is just gone, so it blows up. That's not good. And pathology, I don't know, you could argue is even worse because common pathologies from protein misfolding would include Alzheimer's disease, right? and Parkinson's disease, both of which at their core have this problem of misfolded proteins. So again, you have the protein that was produced, it's misfolded, okay? Your body can't repair it, and these misfolded proteins basically clump together and cause neurodegenerative problems. So now that would make you really want to think about, I want my protein folding to work well. And in addition to getting in a sauna all the time, you can look at amino acid levels and fix it from that perspective. I'll show you that in a sec. So, and then there's autophagy. This is means self-eating. So that's the intracellular degradation system where you get old or damaged organelles or old or damaged proteins. You could also get bad stuff, pathogens, and you break them down, and then you release them back into the cytosol. So autophagy is sort of a buzzword in longevity medicine that, it happens when you're fasting. It happens under a lot of different circumstances. But what we're talking about here, hopefully, makes sense from a biochemical perspective, because we're really concerned mostly with, for the purposes of this talk, proteins. So in general, with proteins, you've got an inflow of amino acids and you've got an outflow of amino acids. And when you run an amino acid test, you're looking at how much amino acid, how much of a given of these 20 amino acids is in the system. And if you have a deficiency of an amino acid, one of the 20, guess what happens to protein folding? Well, it doesn't go very well because you need all 20 amino acids to make all proteins except for collagen, which is a little different. And so if you're missing an amino acid on an amino acid test, and these are tests that are easily run in a functional medicine clinic, you've got a misfolded protein problem just because you don't have enough amino acids. If you layer on top of that some genetic tendency, you layer on top of that maybe some damage to the proteins themselves, then you're going to have a pretty big problem. But if you don't have all 20 amino acids in the right amount in your system, you're going to end up being at high risk for a protein folding problem. Okay, and why risk it? It's an easy thing to test for. It's the easiest thing in the world to fix. If you're low in lysine, you take lysine, and then the levels come back up. It's very straightforward. Okay, so anyways, protein misfolding and folding is something you can deal with. You can do amino acid testing. You can do a whole bunch of other kinds of tests that look at the body's processing and use of amino acids, because there's things that we have to do to get the amino acids into the cells. You need B vitamins to utilize amino acids. They're what help you metabolize and make use of amino acids. So there's also a strong role to play with with B vitamins and all this. Okay. All right, so just a moment on the cell danger response, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. So we'll have questions at the end here. Any questions you guys may have, just go for it. So let's see, cell danger response. This is Dr. Robert Navio, his work. And I think this is really important because if the person's in having any hint of the cell danger response, then their healing processes are interrupted with. And so I think that's a super important thing. And we can measure for this. There's a whole variety of ways you can look at this so you can correct it. But I'll just show you, in a nutshell, if you have an activation of the cell danger response and the person's stuck somewhere in this cycle, then the cells go through, I don't know, it's not really a suicide mission, but it's kind of close to that. It's not a good thing. And this can be activated by infection, by stress. This can be activated by environmental toxicity exposure. Lots of different things can trigger this. But once the cell danger response is disrupted and you're not in the healing pattern anymore, then your mitochondria do a couple of really strange things. It makes sense when you think about it. Normally, the mitochondria take oxygen and they use the oxygen in the electron transport chain so you can make ATP. When this cell danger response gets triggered, that oxygen, your body's like, I don't think we're going to be making ATP today. This is just not what we need. We need to protect the cell. So it takes the oxygen and it makes reactive oxygen species from it. It purposely starts to create oxidative stress inside the cell, right? Because it could be a virus that it's trying to destroy. It's actually trying to make the cell itself a toxic environment. Your mitochondria also start to make inflammatory fatty acids. They start to produce inflammatory fatty acids and cram those fatty acids into the cell membranes. It seems self-destructive, and it is kind of, because this then alerts the cells around that this cell is having a big problem. This cell is kind of in the process of imploding. this cell is becoming full of free radicals that it's generating. This cell's membranes are becoming damaged and it's creating that problem. And the signals start to go out so that the body can see, other cells can see that there's a problem there. So anyway, sometimes people get stuck in this response, and you definitely want to reverse them out of this because it's a key component to getting the mitochondria to work right. Let's see. I'm gonna run out of time here, but I'm gonna do one more slide that I think the important one here we'll do on exercise. So as I mentioned earlier, if it's a process to get people to exercise on a regular basis, it can easily take a year or two until you achieve that. I understand that. And a lot of our patients aren't exercising at all. And they're not just going to wake up the next week and every morning and start to do all these things. But it's a process. You start doing it yourself, you start to figure out ways to convince other people to do it too. But eventually you lead to this point where everybody's doing high intensity interval training. It doesn't have to be a lot. 10 minutes twice a week, 15 minutes twice a week is plenty. Zone 2 training. Like I said, you've got to make sure the beta oxidation is working right. And if it is, then they can do that for, 2, 3, 4 hours a week. Zone 2 is easy. Most people actually enjoy it. It's kind of fun. And then resistance training. Some people love strength training. Some people hate it, but there's no way around resistance training. So that's probably the hardest one in my experience to get people to do on a regular basis. For people that don't like to go to the gym and use weights, you have to figure out ways they can do it. And there's lots of different ways you can do resistance training with bands. And my mom is 87 years old. She's doing resistance training. If I can get my mother to do resistance training, you can get anyone to do it. And in fact, we were just talking like a week ago because it's so cute. She's been using 2-pound weights to do these certain exercises. I was like, Mom, and she said, should I go up? I said, yeah. And then when I had dinner with her on Sunday, and she said, Danny, I'm using 3 pounds. It's so much harder. Okay, 3 pounds. So she's 87 years old. She's doing curls with like 3 pounds, whatever. She's in the exercise classes like 3 or 4 times a week, the place she lives. So anybody can do this. If you can get my mom to do it, you can get anyone to do it. It just takes a little bit of work, okay? All right, so I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to cover questions. Before we get to that, for those that joined us late, we have a year-long certification. The first part of it is starting right now in March, in about 2 weeks. If you want to sign up for the whole year, you can save up to $1,000. We have a bunch of discount codes. You scan these QR codes, you can talk to the team, talk to myself about the class, and we'll get you oriented and get you signed up, okay, and explain what it's all about. But there's 4 basic modules. We're starting with cardiometabolic, gut, brain, toxins, and hormones and immune are coming up. And if you're interested in just signing up for the current module, you can do that as well. There's a different QR code for that, okay? And I hope to see a bunch of you in the class in a few weeks. So let's start to look at questions. Kate is asking, is there a replay? Absolutely yes. We're going to send out a copy of the recording. So look for your email in your email box in the next day or so. You get a copy of this recording. And if you're confused about the QR codes, we'll also be sending those in the email too. So if you want to sign up for one of these classes, you can go for it. Let's see, other questions. Ani, yes, so you can, different practitioners can, different types of practitioners can do this class. So we have nurse practitioners, medical doctors, chiropractors, acupuncturists, health coaches, naturopaths, and a ton of acupuncturists, so I didn't say acupuncture already. So it's applicable to anyone who's interested in functional medicine. Whether you have a practice now already or you're just starting one, it can be. And another thing I think this is going to be a really helpful class for, and this is one of the reasons I designed it, is if you have a functional medicine clinic running now, okay, and you want to have a plan for what do you do when people are better and their autoimmune disease is better now. You want to have a track to put them on to keep them healthy, and this longevity program can be used for chronically ill people who are now better, so you can extend the treatments that you have to offer people. And it's not just about making the autoimmune thing go away, but it's also about overall health and fitness and wellness. And you can also use this for people that are already healthy and aren't chronically ill, that just want to come into your practice and like, what's this all about? Well, you don't have to have a health problem if you just want to have a long, healthy life. We can start by doing these labs and understanding how to help you. How do you get a hold of our team? Well, you can be getting emails. It's training@kalishinstitute.com. Training@kalishinstitute.com is the email. And then you should have emails from us too. You can just respond to the emails that you get. But it's training@kalishinstitute.com. And then how long is the class? So the class, this individual module is 3 months long. And I think we have 5 live calls where we are going to review labs and talk about cases and go through any questions that you guys have. So we'll be plenty of time to discuss things. We're going to have a small group. If we get larger groups signed up for a class, then we open up a separate class time. So never going to have more than 10 or 15 practitioners in a given group. And 5 live calls and a huge curriculum that you're watching on your own time that's all posted online. Okay, and then the case studies are all done during the live calls, so we can view. And then we want you submitting your labs on yourself. You're testing yourself, and your labs. And we'll talk about which labs I recommend. Kind of open to a bunch of different options there, different companies depending on your favorite company, and then eventually labs on your patients as well, so that you start to see how this can get incorporated into an overall wellness program. And then they're designed to be layered. So we have the cardiometabolic, then we have gut brain, then we have toxins, then we have hormones and immune. And by the end of the year, you should start to become familiar with all of these tests. Pick out what are your favorites. Maybe you do them all. You don't have to. You might end up with 1 or 2 favorites that you want to do as your kind of core longevity program. Probably most of you will end up doing all the testing eventually, but that takes a little bit of time to learn how to do all that, Let's see. And Constance had a question. How to convince vegetarians they likely need to eat at least some more animal products. Yeah, so you run amino acid testing, and basically you see if their amino acids are deficient or not. If they're not, then they're getting enough protein. If their amino acids are deficient, we have a bunch of different ways for a vegetarian to make up for that, whether it's protein powders, or, I mean, they don't have to eat animal products. You can have super healthy people that don't eat any animal products for sure, okay? Let's see. Yeah, and then let's see, Meg is asking about lab work for blood labs. So there's another level to this also for sure. There's advanced lipid panels. We're getting into a touch of that in the cardiometabolic, but it's not a class designed to get into the advanced lipid panels. I would see that as like the next step once you've got these basic issues resolved. But we are going to talk about a few of those markers, but it's not extensive. It's not a course that's going to get into that in detail, but we're going to touch on it a little bit. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up for now. Thank you guys so much, and I hope to see you, some of you, in the course that's starting in a couple of weeks. All right, talk soon.